101. That is the total number of Pumas Germany produced across the entire war, not per month, not per factory, in total, across every assembly line, for every front, for every unit that ever requested one. A standard German tank battalion of the period fielded 50 to 80 vehicles. All the Pumas ever built would barely fill 2 of them. They were distributed across 6 formations on 2 fronts covering thousands of kilometers of contact line, which meant that in practice, each unit that received them got a handful, integrated into mixed reconnaissance companies, never concentrated enough to operate as an independent force. And yet when Allied engineers captured examples after the war and brought them back to ordnance yards in Britain and the United States for testing, the verdict was unanimous. The Puma was the finest armoured car of the Second World War. The principles it embodied, monocoque hull, all-wheel drive with independent suspension, air-cooled diesel range, dual control stations, became the template every serious wheeled combat vehicle followed for the next half-century. 101 machines, one of the most consequential engineering concepts in armoured vehicle history. The question is, how both of those things can be simultaneously true? The answer starts not with the Puma, but with the problem it was built to solve. And that problem had been building since the mid-1930s, when it became clear that the standard armoured car concept had hit a wall it could not climb over. Germany's 6-wheeled armoured cars of the early 1930s were capable machines on paper. They were fast, reasonably armed, and far cheaper to produce and maintain than tracked vehicles. The problem surfaced the moment they drove off a paved road. A 6-wheel chassis with 4 driven wheels, the standard configuration of the period, bogged down in soft ground, got stuck in mud, and lost traction on terrain that a light tank crossed without effort. Fitting removable track sections over the rear wheels helped in theory, and created operational nightmares in practice. Every difficult section required the crew to stop, fit the tracks, cross, stop again, remove them. In training it was inconvenient. Under fire it was potentially fatal. By the late 1930s it was clear that the commercial chassis armoured car had exhausted its evolutionary potential. The next generation would have to be built from first principles. Germany's answer arrived in 1936 in the form of the Sd.Kfz, 231 8-wheeler, just a purpose-designed military vehicle with 8 wheels all driven independently, each on its own suspension, capable of maintaining traction when any single wheel lost contact with the ground. It could climb slopes of 30 degrees, cross ditches 2 meters wide, and ford water a meter deep. For a wheeled vehicle of that era, those numbers were genuinely remarkable, enough to make military engineers from other countries study the design with serious attention. It was fast, it was reliable, and it changed what wheeled reconnaissance vehicles could do in the field. It was also, within a few years, obsolete. Not because it had failed, but because the war it was designed for had evolved beyond what its designers had anticipated. The replacement program that began in 1940 produced something that shared a general layout with the 8-wheeler and almost nothing else. The new vehicle, eventually designated the Sd.Kfz 234, was built around 2 engineering decisions that broke with every convention in German armoured vehicle production. The first was the hull. Every armoured vehicle of the period, every car, every truck, every armoured fighting vehicle, was built on a frame, a rigid steel spine to which everything else attached. The body sat on top of the frame. The frame carried the load. It was the universal solution proven by decades of automotive practice, and the designers of the Sd.Kfz 234 abandoned it entirely. The new vehicle would use a monocoque hull, meaning the armoured plates themselves formed the load-bearing structure. There was no frame beneath them. The hull carried the mechanical loads, the crew, the engine, and the suspension directly. The result was lighter, more rigid, and structurally more efficient than anything the frame-based approach could achieve at comparable weight. In 1943, on a military vehicle, this was not an incremental improvement. It was a generation shift. Every modern wheeled armoured vehicle built since uses the same principle. The second decision was the engine. German armoured vehicles ran almost exclusively on petrol engines, reliable, well understood, and supplied through an established logistics chain. The Sd.Kfz 234 received a 12-cylinder diesel engine from the Czechoslovakian manufacturer Tatra, air-cooled, producing around 210 horsepower. Air cooling eliminated the entire radiator system. the hoses, the coolant, the pump, every component that could be punctured by enemy fire or fail from overheating in desert conditions. A punctured radiator could immobilize a conventional vehicle within minutes. An air-cooled engine had no radiator to puncture. The diesel fuel itself burned more efficiently than petrol, and combined with a 360-litre internal fuel tank, the range figure that resulted was extraordinary for a combat vehicle of that era. Approximately 1,000 kilometers on a good road, the distance from Berlin to Paris. A vehicle that could operate that far from its fuel source required an entirely different approach to deep reconnaissance planning. It did not need a supply convoy shadowing its movements. It did not need to interrupt a mission to refuel. It could simply go. The Sd.Kfz 234 inherited one feature from its predecessor that deserved to survive: the dual control station. A standard driver sat at the front. A second driver, with a full set of controls, sat at the rear. When a reconnaissance vehicle drove into an ambush, which reconnaissance vehicles did regularly, the standard response required turning around. Turning around took time, required space, and kept the vehicle exposed while the maneuver was completed. The Sd.Kfz 234 had a different answer. The rear driver took control, the transfer case engaged reverse, and the vehicle retreated at the same speed it had arrived, facing the direction of travel, without turning at all. 24 forward speeds and 24 in reverse. A tactical capability that changed how patrols could operate in contested terrain, and that no other vehicle in any army of the period offered. 4 variants were built on this chassis. The one called the Puma was the second. Its turret had not been designed for it. German engineers had developed a compact, well-armoured turret for a proposed light tank designated the Leopard, a vehicle that was cancelled before production began, leaving the turret without a platform. When the question of arming the Sd.Kfz 234/2 arose, the orphaned turret was adapted for the purpose. The main gun was a 50mm KWK 39/1 with a barrel 60 calibers long. The same weapon fitted to late-production Panzer III tanks, but with a muzzle brake added to manage recoil forces within the lighter vehicle. At 500 meters, under the right conditions and against the right aspect, that gun was dangerous to a T-34. At longer ranges against frontal armor it was not. The Puma was not a tank hunter by design. It was a reconnaissance vehicle with enough firepower to protect itself and engage light and medium-armored targets when the situation demanded, which in the fluid conditions of 1943 and 1944 happened more often than its designers had anticipated. The combat record on both fronts confirmed what the specifications suggested: a vehicle of genuine quality, operating in numbers too small to matter strategically. In Normandy, where hedgerows channeled movement into narrow corridors and eliminated the speed advantage that made wheeled vehicles valuable, Pumas operated as fast tank hunters, using their mobility to engage and disengage before heavier Allied armor could respond effectively. On the Eastern Front, where open terrain allowed the vehicle to use its range and speed as designed, it operated in the reconnaissance role with results that earned it the respect of the crews who used it and the Allied engineers who later captured and examined the survivors. The verdict from those post-war evaluations was consistent. Technically, the finest armoured car the war produced. Production stopped at 101 for reasons that had nothing to do with the vehicle's performance, and everything to do with the circumstances surrounding it. 3 separate pressures converged in 1944 and collectively ended the program. The first was that the target had changed. The Puma's 50mm gun had been chosen when Soviet light tanks were still common on the Eastern Front. By 1944, the Soviet Army had stopped producing light tanks entirely, concentrating production on the T-34 and heavier vehicles. The gun that had been adequate against the previous generation of opponents was now marginal against what it actually faced. The second pressure was tungsten. Sub-caliber ammunition with tungsten cores was what gave the 50mm gun genuine penetrating power against medium armor. Germany's tungsten supply, dependent on trade with Portugal and Spain that Allied diplomatic pressure was steadily throttling, had effectively run out. Without tungsten-cored rounds, the gun's anti-armor capability was sharply reduced. The third pressure was industrial. The Puma required skilled labor, precise machining, and a specific engine from a single supplier. In the autumn of 1944, with factories under aerial bombardment and materials in short supply, a complex vehicle built in small numbers lost the production argument to simpler designs that could be manufactured faster and in greater quantity. The assembly line switched to other variants of the Sd.Kfz 234 family. The Puma was finished. What survived was the idea. Allied engineers who examined captured examples documented every engineering choice: the monocoque hull, the independent suspension, the diesel range, the dual station control, and the principles entered the post-war technical literature. The world took approximately 40 years to catch up. The French AMX-10RC, the Italian Centauro, the South African Roycat, the Japanese Type 16C, wheeled vehicles with closed turrets, serious guns, and the mobility to deploy strategically by air and operate tactically at speed. All of them embody the concept the Puma demonstrated in 1943. They are heavier, better armed, and better protected. The principle is the same. 101 vehicles. None survived the war. Every modern wheeled tank owes something to what was inside them.